Okay. So yeah, we'll go do about 15, 20 minutes of demonstration and then 20 minutes of Q&A afterwards, but obviously feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions. All right. So I'll minimize this. And so you're at this point, I'm assuming if you're on this um, webinar, you're pretty familiar with the general sense of what a code window does and that it, inputs information into the timeline. And so I just thought we'd start at a place that if anyone's new to the code window and you're opening it up for the first time and it's just this blank ocean of space, I think one thing that might be helpful, instead of, I see a lot of people just start dragging buttons down here and double clicking and naming them and experimenting. But I would really encourage you, if this is your first time, just to really maybe think about working out the code window on paper. I mean, literal physical paper. This is just a little drawing that I made of, when I build code windows, kind of my thought process of like, what do I think I want my codes to be and my labels and groups. And then I really want to get a sense of like, okay, how many total codes am I going to need? Because that'll affect how much space I'm going to use in my code window, and same with the labels. And think a little further downstream also, as well as like maybe what's my timeline going to look like? Is this, if I have these 5 code buttons, is this timeline going to be useful for me in a debrief or in conversations with colleagues or things like that, right? So similarly with labels, like if I'm coding a taxi, a bus, a pedestrian, these types of things in an intersection, and I might want to know what direction they enter the intersection from and what sort of maneuver they make, like a turn or go straight through the intersection. When I add labels to the equation, then the next thing in terms of thinking further downstream to consider is the matrix. So I just drew out here in my brainstorming, like, is this a practical or useful matrix for me downstream, right? Like I'll know how many total number of taxis there are and how many came from the north or south and made a turn or went straight. And just, think about some of those things further down the workflow on paper, because that might save you some trial and error time in the actual code window. Okay, so I'll minimize that. Minimize this. And another thing I often see when people start using the code window is just, like I said, slapping sort of buttons in the code window, but and they kind of become a little haphazard like this. One nice feature in the inspector here is this geometry section down at the bottom that's not often utilized. But for example, let's say this button that I click on here, button 001, is 100 by 32. That's the height and width. You can see that these other code buttons are various sizes, and that always happens when you're just clicking and dragging buttons around in the code window. But if I want to make them all the same size, it's easy to just lasso them like that. And then I could click in the, click in these fields here, right? And just make them all a uniform size at the same time. Also, if I wanted to make these all in the same row, if I wanted to make a row out of them, sort of, I could see that in terms of the X and Y axis in the code window, this code button 001, you can see how the X axis works here. If I increase or reduce this size, similar, you can imagine what the Y axis does. So if I want these all in the same Y axis, and it might just be easy to lasso those, enter an 89. Now they're all lined up in terms of verticality. And maybe instead of, I can just use the arrow keys here. Like I've selected that number 5 button, and now I'm using the right arrow key. And it's a really easy way to control the, the sort of fine-grained maneuvering of those buttons. And now that I have this sort of row established, you know, it might be easier, instead of doing that to all of these, just to delete them and copy and paste like this, right? It's a really quick way to make an organized looking code window. So that might help if you're new to building the code window and, you know, using this geometry section down here to quickly organize your buttons. Okay. So one thing that's pretty handy in the code window, particularly if, let's say, one person is in charge of building the code window, but eventually other people will do the actual coding and you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time orienting them to the code window and sort of explaining how the buttons work, is to use image buttons, because sometimes images are more intuitive, right, than the actual words. So if you're not familiar with this, I have an example here. Let me go to Chrome, and you can just find any image, right? And if I right click on it, I can say copy image. That copies it to my clipboard, right? It's like a Command C, in other words. And let me bring this other code window back up just to play around in there for a second. So if I click in this window, like I said a second ago, it's like doing Command C. So now if I click in this window, I can use Command V, like Victor, to paste. And now it's an easy way to paste images in there. So if I double click on that button, you can see that, all right, maybe we'll call this image intersection. And you can see on the code button here, it says intersection, but in this case, we're hoping the picture is more intuitive than the actual words. So maybe I'll just choose not to show the name here or the identifier. But that's, you know, a nice handy tool if you want to leverage something more graphical instead of the actual words. So that's how I got, like, for example, these images in here, the pedestrian. Sorry, one second. The pedestrian, bicycle, and stroller images in there. So you can see that the name of the button is still pedestrian. So if I were to code with it, it's going to create a row, like you can see down in the timeline, and do all the normal sort of work, but you just don't have to display the name. Okay, so, you know, here's a sample little code window I made, and taxi and bus are code buttons, and these north, south, east, west labels or buttons are labels. And if I click on this little icon up here, it lets me reveal the links. So the way in my head that I've planned this code window is that if I click on a label like south, it will activate bus and apply that label south to the bus instance, right? So it dawned on me that as I was building this, I'm probably not ever really going to click on bus or taxi. I'm always just going to click on north, south, east, and west, right? So there's no need to have this bus and taxi button as the most prominent button. And honestly, it's not even necessary to even have it visible, because I might accidentally click on bus without a direction, and that's not really what I'm looking for in terms of my data capture. So in this code window, I've just moved the buttons around. Let me show you this for a second. So I've taken the north, south, east, west, and just sort of moved them like this first of all, and then move the taxi over to the left. But the first point I wanted to make is that, you know, this taxi, and let me show you the links too. So I still have the links, but this taxi button, like I said, I want to make sure I don't accidentally click on it. I want to make sure I click on a north, south, east, and west. So what I thought I would do is actually, if I right click on this taxi button, I can move it to the back in terms of layers in the code window, right? So that's not visible anymore, but now I can use what we call an inactive button, right? And that visually gives me the representation and clues me into what's happening. But that code, that actual code button, let me move some of these buttons over. You can see is way in the background there. You can see the blue, right? So it'll still do the work, but I just won't accidentally click on it anymore. So that might be, a helpful tool or a strategy if you ever need to ensure that a code button is not clicked on. So I'll do the same thing for this one. Right click, move to back. And again, this is an inactive button, right? You can choose what type of button it is on the inspector there. So an inactive button, again, just means that if you click on it, it's not going to do any coding or labeling. It's really just a visual tool for aesthetics or layout purposes in the code window like we're using here. So one other thing I thought after building this initial code window down here was that, I'm going to be coding live. And so I'm going to be watching these vehicles moving through the intersection fairly quickly. And it would really behoove me to have some shortcut keys or some hotkeys. And so then I thought, even though initially I laid these out north, south, east, west in terms of trying to represent some directionality, coding-wise, it'd probably be more efficient if these buttons that I'm going to click on all the time, whoops, let's make that a 3, huh? And that a 4. Not sure how that happened. But now you can imagine if I'm coding, right, at the pace of a taxi or a bus moving through the intersection, it's really simple for me to just keep my left hand, assuming my right hand's on the mouse, on 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those are actually activating the taxi code button in the background, right? And then just below there, if there was a bus, I could just use one of those labels like that. So point there is, think about not necessarily visually what will help you in the code window, but if time is of the essence when you're coding, particularly you guys, I think, Colleen, in healthcare, if you're coding, at the pace of real time, proximity to the buttons in terms of your hand might be your best friend in those cases. Okay. So some other things that you might not be familiar with in the code window is that you can actually get some real-time feedback in the code window in terms of what you've coded. So I've added some new functionality over here that I'll talk about in a little more depth in a second. But the idea is that when I code a pedestrian walking through the intersection, or a bicycle or a stroller, it'd be nice for me to know about how much time, relative to this movie, that they are in the intersection, essentially. So you can see this pedestrian row, you can see how much of the timeline it takes up. This timeline's about 33 minutes. And so all those instances make up about 24 minutes. And that's about 71.1% of this entire timeline. But the nice thing is, let's go ahead and delete the pedestrian row of instances. And now you can see that automatically in real time, this little dashboard is updated so that I now know there's no instances coded. So let's bring the playhead back here. I'll just bring it to the beginning. Let's go to code mode. And let's just imagine there's a pedestrian that enters the intersection, and they're in there walking. And they make it to the other side. And when I mark out, you can see that these numbers update in real time. So again, I can mark in. I'll go ahead and fast forward a little longer there. Mark out. Now you're getting some real-time feedback. So, if that's helpful while you're coding, it's definitely possible. I'm not going to go into too much depth right now about how to make that happen, because we'll have other tutorials and content to help you get through that. But just quickly, what I've done here is, let me move this down. This is just a button, and it's an inactive button, and I made it gray to match the background inactive button that it's on. And then in the inspector, way over here on the last tab, there's a place where you can type some scripts here, or some language that just tells this button to return this information to it. And if this language looks a little Greek right now, it's pretty easy to teach you later, but that's the basic idea, is that you're writing some scripts on this button, and it knows to read the timeline and retrieve, in this case, duration of all the instances in the pedestrian row. So that might be helpful while you're coding. Another thing that's possible in the code window is to actually retrieve, this is a lesser known feature, but is to actually retrieve video from the code window. So for example, this this taxi may have entered from the north, south, east, or west. I have this button, these buttons here. It's meant to be like a play button. That's what it was in my mind, at least. But again, I've scripted, here's a little language, I've scripted this button such that it will actually retrieve the north instances from the taxi row. So in order to make this work, you're probably familiar with edit mode and code mode. You may even use label mode, but another mode here is called report mode. So if I go into report mode and I double click on that button, it'll go retrieve those instances and pull them up. So these are all the instances from the taxi row where it entered from the north, right? What's nice about that is you can now start using the code window to really drive a presentation, for example, or because of sort of the blank canvasness of the code window, you might be able to leverage something graphical or like a heat map or a different type of infographic model that would be more compelling to the viewers. So just keep that in mind. It's possible to retrieve video and watch video straight from the code window. Let's see, it's 10. I'm going to show you one more thing. This is a real world example that, these are all real world examples, but this one just happened to come into us last week, where there was a customer who asked, they have a situation where they have a label here, right? When they click on it, it activates this code button, and the code button has a little lead and lag, so it'll turn itself off. But what they want to do is make sure that once they click this label, they want to be able to visually see that it's been clicked on. So they need some sort of visual cue to let them know that it's been clicked on. But they also want to make sure it's not able to be clicked on again, just to ensure that it's only able to be clicked once. So a strategy we came up with for this is, let me first draw your attention to this little button in the background. It's just an inactive button, you can see. But if I go over to the second tab, you can see that the color of it is black, but we've made the opacity, you can see if I bring the opacity up, it's black. But we brought the opacity down, so it's pretty transparent. And so the way this works is, I'll leave it just offset for a bit. But the way this works is, now if I'm coding, again, they're going to click on the label, and that's going to turn on the code. So if I click on the label, and once the code ends, the label turns red. And can you see that this transparent button came to the foreground? So now it's really on top of that label. I can see that the label turned red, but now if I click on it, I'm really clicking on the inactive button. So it's not able to be clicked on again. Hopefully that makes sense. So really the way it works is, this inactive button is perfectly on top of the code button. Let me delete this. And now when there's no instances in the row, you can see that the transparent button retreats to the background or the back layer. So as soon as this button counts that there's one label or one instance with that label in the timeline, then that transparent button knows to come to the foreground and sort of protect the red label there. So yeah, that's all that I was planning on going over. Can I answer any questions?
Do you mind just quickly going over how you created this this last one, how you had the transparent button? Yeah.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Please just go over it again briefly.
Sure. So here's this button. Let's go back to Square. Let's I'll delete this. Okay. So the first thing I did for this button is I could just bring down a label. I'll double click on it and go to the first tab here, and I will make it inactive because I don't want it to code or the name is pretty irrelevant whether there's a name or not. In this case, that little square we call the identifier. I'm not going to show the identifier. And then in this case, it really doesn't matter the color either because we're going to make it mostly transparent. So you can see the slider bar here.
Yes.
So we'll bring it down to where it's pretty transparent. So now we're at this point, right? So let me switch back up to this code button. This inactive button. And so this inactive button, here's where the scripting comes in to help us, right? So the first thing.
Okay, count label. Okay, label A. Okay.
So $A, well, first thing is button opacity. This just sets the opacity. It's like me sliding the bar. Actually, I probably don't even need this point. But this language just says $A is the way we declare a variable, right? It's just like algebra, X equals something.
Okay, count label A.
Right. So
so if the count is 1, then move the button front, move. Okay.
Exactly.
So once you've clicked on it once, then it moves the inactive button to the front. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Right.
Okay, so, thanks.
For others, just for others in case, so this next command is if, and the way this is formatted is if, and then in this case, we're using this variable, right? $A, so X, if this equals 1, so this is our condition, like if this were algebra, we'll say X equals 1, then the next thing after the comma is what is the action that we want.
The action that you want. Okay.
So we want that action to be move button front in terms of layers. That's the specific command for that button. Okay. And then after the second comma is the action that we want if the condition is not true. So if that condition is 2 or 0, or 2 or more, or 0, then we'll move the button back, right?
Okay. If count is 1, move button. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So you would actually be setting it up. You could even decide 2 or 3 if $A is to move button.
Absolutely. You could, I could also specify like count label A where row equals, and anytime you reference a code button name or label name, you want to put quotes. Right? So now I can make sure that it's only counting the labels in this specific row name.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, and you can find what's nice about this is in the code window is if you ever need sort of a kickstart or an example, let's go down here to this button. You can insert an example script. So here's sort of the plain English way, right? Show a count for all labels, my label. And then you can just change my label to, let's say, north, right? And then in this case, we need to show the output. That's what shows it here. Actually, let's bring this back up. And then when you go to label mode or code mode, that's what will sort of return the information. So that's also gives you a glimpse, right, on how we got these things.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Of course, yeah. Any other questions that I can help answer, or any, I don't know, maybe you have some ideas, or is this possible capabilities types of questions?
Duration of instances. Okay. Think about use.
Any of these things that we went over might be helpful in taking back to your work?
Certainly. Like I'm thinking of the where you're able to retrieve the video for particular instances. Like if you're making a presentation and maybe you want to focus on a particular code, like, okay, for me, we use this for classroom videos, teaching mathematics classroom videos.
Sure.
And maybe if you want to maybe highlight a particular code, maybe a particular teacher move, and I'm just thinking, I mean, I'm actually looking forward to using this. Like if I wanted to highlight, maybe just look at a particular move that teachers maybe did. And I want to just look at video for that, for a teacher, for a particular lesson. I'm thinking the one for retrieving, being able to retrieve video from the code window would really, really be useful.
Okay.
As a way of focusing on a particular code.
Yeah.
And just looking across, I think that would certainly be useful for me.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds like a good use case for it.
Yeah.
Well, if you need help with getting pointed in the right direction with any of that, let me know offline and I can help.
And then I really also appreciate, I mean, I've always prepared code windows, but never thought of having them with labels, that's nice. I mean, just to be able to have a code window that is intuitive, that you can just look at. And the fact that I can drag the labels from elsewhere and just put them there. I was also thinking of what you were talking about, the duration of instances. I think that maybe it's something that right now may not be applicable to the kind of coding that we're doing, but I'm just thinking of maybe articles that sometimes I've read that are focusing maybe on interactions, like maybe teacher-student interactions, or more recently I was reading an article about teacher educators and novice teachers and their interactions. And did they use Studiocode? Yeah, they did use Studiocode. And they were talking about the interactions, like they actually were able to give the time that it took for certain kinds of interactions, because they coded the interactions. And so they had a code for the different types of interactions. And they were actually able to report on the time that, the amount of time that certain specific types of interactions took over the period of it was a rehearsal.
Sure, yeah, that's definitely possible in Studio.
Yeah, and so now I'm seeing where that came from.
Well, I can tell you, so let me show you this, just so you're aware. There's this is maybe going a little off course from what we were intended to cover today, but just since you brought it up. I'm going to go up to the analysis menu here and go to, oh no, sorry, File, Export. And I'm going to go to Instance Frequency Report. There's a few different built-in reports to Studiocode that you can get. So if I go to Instance Frequency Report, you can choose to export this report to Excel or Output. Output's just a Studiocode window. I'll keep it in Studiocode for now. So this is just a really easy way to get, maybe you can see there, here's the row names. This is the count of the instances, the total time that they make up, and the percentage relative to the whole timeline or the whole movie again, and then the mean time per instance. So that, you can go and grab this report, the instance frequency report, at any time. I think the advantage or the difference with doing it here is if it helps inform, your work while you're coding.
Or while I'm coding. Okay, so this is more useful while I'm coding. This is more useful like when I want a report and I want to do my analysis.
Right. I mean, just kind of depends on when in your work. And with what frequency maybe you want access to that information. Okay.
No, this is useful. This is definitely useful because I'm just about to start an analysis of some coding that we've been doing, and we need frequency counts. And we need frequency counts for the different codes. So that is useful.
Oh, great. Yeah, if you should make sure if those types of, measurables are valuable to you, make sure to watch the statistical window webinar that we'll have, because there's a lot of flexibility in getting, quantifiable information out with that tool.
When is that? Or we'll get information. We should expect an email maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's next month or the month after, but and even if that's too far away, just email support@vosaic.com and we can help you, show you some of those things as well.
Okay. This is helpful. I really, really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
It is helpful.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Any other questions from Colleen? Anyone else that I can help with?
No, but this is really helpful, Justin. It's kind of giving us an idea of what we need to be looking at and how we can improve the code windows that we already have. So it's kind of turned our brains on a little bit, and we appreciate it.
Great. Well, let that marinate and let me know if you have any more questions, offline. I'm happy to help.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks for the time today. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar.
Yes. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.